April 12th of 1945, Baguio in the Philippines. 24 Japanese women knelt in the wet earth of a rough camp, their hands pressed together in prayer. They were not praying for rescue, they were praying for death. The sky above them looked the color of ash, and far away American voices rolled through the morning air. This was the ending they had been trained to expect. Swift, brutal, final. The women listened to the sound of boots drawing near, heavy and purposeful American boots. Lieutenant Yoshiko shut her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She had told the others to meet death with dignity as loyal servants of the emperor, yet her heart pounded against her ribs. Images from the propaganda film she had watched flickered in her mind. American troops laughing as they stabbed prisoners with bayonets. American troops burning entire villages. American troops who spared no captives and showed no mercy. And then the marching stopped. The gate of the enclosure swung open, but the Americans were not holding rifles. They were holding crates filled with food, medical supplies, and blankets. And in that instant, while kneeling in the Philippine mud, these women understood that everything they had been taught was false. The account of these 24 Japanese women taken as prisoners of war is one that history rarely mentions. No major schoolbooks record their names. No films retell their hardship. But what they endured reveals something deep about war, propaganda, and the stubborn endurance of human kindness during humanity's darkest moments. What unfolded in that small camp during the next several weeks would break assumptions on both sides of the Pacific and show that even in total war, compassion could endure. To understand why these women knelt expecting to be executed, we must go back 6 months. In October of 1944, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, keeping his well-known promise. The Japanese garrison, which had occupied the island since 1942, was now engaged in a desperate defensive struggle. Among the 30,000 Japanese troops scattered across Luzon were about 200 women, including nurses, communications staff, administrative clerks, and comfort station managers. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 left no doubt about the meaning of capture. The Senjinkan, the military code issued to all imperial personnel, stated clearly that one must not live to endure the shame of becoming a prisoner. Officers carried capsules of cyanide. Soldiers were trained to use their own grenades rather than surrender. The idea of surrender was so alien to Japanese military tradition that the word itself, kasen, implied the deepest disgrace. For Japanese women serving in uniform, the danger was even greater. Military propaganda had taught them that American soldiers were brutal savages who harmed and killed female captives without hesitation. These fears were not created at random. They were intentional psychological tools meant to stop surrender and ensure that soldiers fought until death. Japanese news films showed staged scenes of American crimes. Radio programs described imaginary mass killings. Officers repeated these tales until they became accepted as truth. By March of 1945, as American troops advanced into the rugged Baguio highlands, the Japanese defensive line collapsed. Most Japanese forces pulled back into the mountains to fight as guerrillas. But about 24 women, including nurses from a field hospital, 3 communications officers, and several administrative workers, found themselves isolated from the main group. For 3 weeks they hid in deserted buildings and caves, staying alive on gathered roots and polluted water. Sergeant Machiko Tanaka, 31 years old, had worked as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before her posting to the Philippines. She kept a diary, parts of which survived the war. On March 28th, she wrote that they had no food and no medicine, and that Fumo was burning with fever. She wrote that at night they heard American patrols walking nearby, and that each night she believed the next morning would be the end when they would finally be found. The moment of capture arrived not through violence but through exhaustion. On April the 1st, an American patrol located the women in a collapsed warehouse on the outskirts of Baguio. Private First Class Robert Chen, a Nisi soldier serving as an interpreter, was part of the patrol. His account, preserved in a 1982 oral history interview, describes what he saw. They were crouched in a corner, pressed together like frightened animals. Their uniforms were ripped. Some had no shoes. When they noticed the patrol, they did not flee. They simply closed their eyes and began to pray. He believed they were praying for mercy. Later, he learned they were praying for death. The women were taken to a temporary holding compound outside the city. It was not a standard prisoner camp. American units were moving too quickly to build permanent facilities. It was only a guarded enclosure with a few tents and a water source. The women were given a place to sleep and small daily portions of food, rice porridge served twice each day and sometimes a bit of dried fish. The American guards, mostly young infantrymen from the 33rd Division, had no experience handling female prisoners. Most had never even seen a Japanese woman in uniform. Their instructions were simple: secure the perimeter, stop any escape, provide basic humanitarian treatment as described in the Geneva Convention. But those instructions did not explain how to respond when prisoners refused to eat because they believed the food was poisoned. During the first week, the women barely tasted their meals. They were certain the Americans were feeding them only to prepare them for worse cruelty. Nurse Fumiko Sado, 26 years old, later explained through an interpreter that they believed the soldiers were toying with them the way a cat plays with a mouse. She said they waited each day for the moment when the game would end. Malnutrition and sickness spread quickly. Several women suffered from dysentery. Fumiko's fever grew worse and became pneumonia. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, the senior officer among them, tried to uphold military discipline, but it felt pointless. They were no longer soldiers. They felt like spirits waiting to disappear. The compound itself showed a world of contrasts. Outside the fence, American supply trucks rattled past carrying ammunition and food toward frontline troops. Inside, 24 women lingered in a shadowy space between life and death, holding on to the one belief they had been taught, that Americans offered no mercy. Then came April the 12th, the day everything changed. Captain William Morrison, 34 years old, had been a high school history teacher in Portland before the war. He had landed at Leyte Gulf in October and fought his way north through some of the most brutal battles in the Pacific Campaign. He had watched men die in ways that would stay with him forever. He had learned to separate his emotions, to see the enemy simply as the enemy and to do whatever had to be done. But when he visited the detention compound that morning during a routine inspection, what he witnessed broke through his defenses. These were not enemy fighters. They were starving and terrified women who looked as if life had already left them. Morrison's interpreter, Private Chen, explained the situation. The women believed they were being held for execution. They assumed the small food portions were intentional cruelty. They expected torture. Morrison stood there in the morning sunlight staring at 24 human beings who had been so deeply shaped by their own propaganda that they could not even recognize compassion. And he made a choice that was not written in any handbook. He turned to his supply sergeant and asked for breakfast. He said he wanted real breakfast with everything they had available. Within 1 hour, soldiers returned carrying crates from the division supply depot. The smell reached the compound before the crates did. It was a smell the women had not encountered in months. Fresh bread, canned meat, fruit cocktail, coffee, and chocolate bars. The American soldiers opened the crates in the center of the compound. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22 years old, watched the faces of the women. They simply stared, he later wrote to his sister, as if they could not believe what they were seeing. One of them began to cry, then another followed. Soon they were all weeping. He wrote that he had never witnessed anything like it. Sergeant Matiko was the first to react. She rose slowly, walked toward the crates, and picked up a can of corned beef. She studied it, turned it over in her hands, and then looked at Captain Morrison. She said something in Japanese. Private Chen translated that she was asking if it was poisoned. Morrison took the can from her, opened it with his knife, and ate a forkful right in front of her. Then he handed it back to her. He said to tell her it was real. He said to tell her they were not going to die that day. The emotional barrier broke. The women moved forward, not in a rush, but with slow and careful steps. They collected the food cautiously as if it might disappear at any moment. Some sat down immediately and began to eat. Others carried food to the sick women who were too weak to stand. Private Yuki Harada, 19 years old and the youngest among them, picked up a chocolate bar and held it as though it was something sacred. She later explained through an interpreter that she thought she was dreaming. She said she believed she had died and entered some kind of afterlife. She said she could not understand why their enemies were feeding them. But food was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Captain Morrison secured medical supplies. An army medic examined Fumiko and started her on sulfur medicine to treat her pneumonia. Canvas sheets replaced the muddy ground. A water purification unit provided clean drinking water. The compound shifted from a simple holding area into something resembling a real prisoner facility. The change in the women happened gradually but could be clearly seen. They began to eat on a regular schedule. Color returned to their faces. The heavy tension that had hung over the compound started to fade. But the inner psychological shift was slower and far more complicated. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled with this the most. She had been trained as an officer, taught to lead, to enforce discipline, and to uphold the honor of the emperor. But how did honor survive when the enemy was feeding her? How did discipline matter when her own military had abandoned her? She had spent 3 years believing Americans were monsters. Now those same monsters were treating her injuries and teaching her English words. The Americans were dealing with their own contradictions. These prisoners were enemy soldiers, Japanese soldiers, members of the same military that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same military that had committed atrocities throughout Asia, the same military that had killed their friends in battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Yet here the Americans were, offering cigarettes and chocolate, teaching card games, and showing photos of their families back home. Corporal Rodriguez found himself in a philosophical argument with another soldier, Private Eddie Walsh. Walsh said he still did not understand. He said that on the battlefield they were told to kill these people, but here they were expected to be kind to them. He asked where the line was. Rodriguez thought for a moment. He said maybe there was no line. He said maybe that was the entire point. By the end of April, something remarkable had taken form inside the compound. Not exactly friendship. The divide was far too great for that, but something even more meaningful had emerged. Recognition. Recognition that the enemy was also human. Recognition that humanity could survive even when everything else collapsed. The Japanese women began teaching the American guards simple Japanese words and phrases. The Americans taught them English in return. They exchanged stories cautiously at first, then with more openness. Sergeant Matiko, who had served as a nurse, worked with the American medics on caring for the ill women. Her medical knowledge was treated with respect and appreciation. Lieutenant Yoshiko found herself discussing logistical matters with Captain Morrison. They talked about where to dig latrines, how to arrange the sleeping area, and other practical concerns that required no ideology, only common sense. One afternoon in early May, a sudden tropical downpour sent everyone running for cover. Private Yuki ended up beneath a tarp with 3 American soldiers. They sat there watching the rainfall, and someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. For 20 minutes they were simply people trying to stay dry during a storm. When the rain ended, Yuki looked at the soldiers and said in slow English that it was the same rain and the same sky. One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded. He said yes, same rain. It was a small moment, easy to forget, but it represented something enormous. It showed a fracture in the absolute certainties that war demanded, a brief look at the world as it truly was instead of the way propaganda described it. The fighting in the Philippines was essentially finished by late May. The Japanese defensive lines had collapsed. The remaining Japanese units were scattered throughout the mountains, cut off from support and leadership. On May 8, Germany surrendered, though the news took several days to reach the isolated Philippine camps. The Pacific War continued, but everyone sensed it was entering its final stage. Captain Morrison received instructions to transfer the women prisoners to a larger prisoner facility in Manila. The compound would be shut down. The Americans would move north. The brief and unusual community that had taken shape would come to an end. The evening before the transfer, Morrison gathered the women and explained through Private Chen what was going to happen. They would be taken to Manila. They would receive proper medical treatment. Eventually, when the war ended, they would be sent back to Japan. The women listened without speaking. Sergeant Matiko finally addressed him. Private Chen translated her question. She wanted to know if he would be in Manila. Morrison shook his head. He said no, his unit was moving in a different direction. Matiko nodded slowly. Then she bowed deeply and formally. The other women followed her. It was not a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of recognition. Morrison, uneasy with the formality, returned the bow in an awkward way. He said they deserved to be treated like human beings. He said he was glad they could offer at least that much. The next morning, trucks arrived to carry the women to Manila. As they prepared to depart, each woman said goodbye to the soldiers they had come to know. Lieutenant Yoshiko shook Captain Morrison's hand. She told him in careful English that he had shown them everything they had been told was wrong. Morrison nodded. He said maybe that was the real victory, learning that the enemy is simply people. The women reached Manila on May 12 and were processed into a larger prisoner facility that held several hundred Japanese captives, both military personnel and civilians. The facility was better supplied than the compound, with barracks, a proper infirmary, and organized meal halls. But something was lost in the move. The closeness of the small compound, the daily interactions that had humanized both sides, was replaced by an institutional routine. The psychological aftermath appeared slowly. Nurse Fumiko, now healed from pneumonia, began experiencing nightmares. She dreamed she was still in the compound, but in those dreams the Americans were the monsters portrayed in the propaganda. She would wake up unsettled, unsure which version of reality was true. An army psychologist, Captain Alina Hayes, noted in her report that many female Japanese prisoners showed signs of severe cognitive dissonance. Their lived experience contradicted everything their military training had taught them to believe. Lieutenant Yoshiko faced a different crisis, a crisis of identity. She had always defined herself as an officer of the Imperial Army. But what did that role mean now? Her army had left her behind. Her country was losing. The enemy had shown her more honor than her own leaders. She spent long hours in the facility's small library, reading whatever books were available in Japanese, trying to rebuild her sense of who she was. Private Yuki, the youngest, adjusted the most easily. She was barely past childhood, less shaped by rigid military doctrine. She made friends with some of the civilian women prisoners, learned more English, and even taught Japanese to a few of the American nurses at the facility. She was creating something new out of the remains of what had fallen apart. On August 15th of 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over inside the Manila prisoner facility. The news brought relief, sorrow, and uncertainty. For many, surrender was unimaginable. Some refused to accept it. Others cried openly. Sergeant Matiko stood listening, tears running down her face, though she did not fully know why. Defeat, relief, or lost years. She could not decide which feeling it was. She thought of Captain Morrison and the Americans who had given her food when she expected death. They had won more than the war. They had shown her that even in chaos, humanity could endure. Repatriation took months. The women from the Baguio compound waited in Manila, writing letters home, uncertain about which truths they were allowed to share. In November, they were placed on a United States Navy transport ship headed for Japan. As Lieutenant Yoshiko stepped aboard, Captain Hayes asked her what she would tell people. She replied that she would tell them the enemy had taught her more about honor than her own commanders had. 12 days later, they arrived at Uraga Harbor. Japan lay in ruins, with cities burned, people starving, and hope scarce. Returning home was more difficult than captivity. Mitiko discovered her village near Hiroshima half destroyed, but her family still alive. Her mother urged her to stay silent about the war, but Mitiko could not remain quiet. She worked in a clinic, telling patients about the American who had brought them breakfast. Some people doubted her story. One elderly doctor said that perhaps this was how the nation would rebuild, not with weapons, but with empathy. Yoshiko reunited with her husband, a naval officer. Their first conversations were filled with strain. He had fought Americans while she had learned to see them as human beings. Slowly, they discovered shared ground in their exhaustion and their desire for peace. Private Yuki, only 20 years old, struggled the most. She had known nothing except war, yet she found meaning teaching English in Yokohama. When her students asked where she had learned it, she replied that she had learned it from the enemy, and that the enemy had shown her that opponents can become teachers. In 1947, 15 of the 24 women gathered again in Tokyo. Over a simple meal, they raised a toast to surviving. Yoshiko said, "To survival." Fumiko, the nurse, added, "To the men who showed us that survival could still be honorable." Yuki whispered, "To second chances," and Mitiko said softly, "To remembering. So we never forget what humanity looks like even in war." The reunions became fewer as the years passed. In 1982, historian Thomas Nakamura interviewed Mitiko, now 73 years old. She showed him her diary. She said the Americans brought them food and wondered aloud how they were supposed to understand enemies who fed them. She said the most dangerous lies are the ones that make us see others as less than human. Captain Morrison recalled it simply. He said they gave them breakfast instead. No medals, no headlines, only a stone memorial in Tokyo. If you are finding meaning in these hidden chapters of history, tap the like button and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Whether you are in Tokyo, in Texas, or anywhere else, your support keeps these forgotten histories alive.